So I am Paul Risson. I have been working at the BBC since 2006, and I'm going to talk to you about our use of linked data and connected data at the BBC, with particular focus probably less on the technical details and more on what it's enabled us to do, so the audience-facing value of all of that, really. First of all, who remembers 2006? There you one person remembers 2006. Okay, 2006, George W. Bush was the president. It was a very different world. Zinedine Zidane headbutted an Italian in the World Cup final. And more importantly, or probably most interestingly to this group in technology, Facebook opened itself up to anyone who wanted an account. Amazon Web Services was launched, and a little thing called BBC iPlayer was announced in 2006. So it was a very different world, and it would be completely foolish of me to try and cover 10 years worth of development in about half an hour. I'm going to lie, because actually what I want to cover starts in about 2004, so 12 years worth of development. It's worth starting with the rationale of connected data. So why is and was the BBC interested in doing this in the first place, seeing as we started back in 2004? I'm sure most of you are familiar with the BBC, but here are the standard introductory slides. So at the time, we had 8 national TV channels. Yes, BBC Three was still up there, and at least 10 national radio stations and lots of local ones as well. Back in 2004, this was the BBC's main thing that it does, right? Programs, news, sport, things like that. In terms of the web, everything was very sparse and wild west. There wasn't really a standard approach to how the BBC tackled the internet. There was the news website, there was a sport website, but in terms of programs, you only really had a program website if you made room in your budget, your program budget, to make a website. So only the biggest programs really had websites. And they were very much marketing things, right? They were done for the big launch of the program. If you're lucky, they stuck around and got updated during broadcast, but after that, nobody really cared about them. They probably disappeared off the web quite soon after. So one big problem was user requests. So there was a vast amount of users who couldn't find the information they wanted or needed. And again, if you think back to 2004, you're looking at the beginnings of social networks, blogging being a big thing. So the fact that you couldn't link to the things that the audience were interested in was a massive problem. So here's 2 examples of various blog posts going around the time saying, I can't find the program that I was most interested in, and I want to be able to link it because I want to be able to share it with my friends. And it's gone. And the BBC is a public service. It's kind of failing in its duty to, make information available to the audience. So the route we took was BBC/programs. So this is a single URL for every program that the BBC has ever produced. The potential. So when we're talking about connected data and linked data, the key thing here was having an address for something on the web. So being able to point at something, being able to link to it, interrogate it, make use of it. That, of course, is really at the heart of Sir Tim Berners-Lee's vision of semantic web. So /programs was born. So there, from the manifesto, permanent, findable web presence for every TV and radio program. And based on the principles of linked open data. So at this point, it's key to stress that we weren't using a triple store. We were using a relational database, and it's perfectly possible, as other speakers have said, to do linked data and connected data using existing technologies. because this is very much about publishing open data. RDF is a model for publishing data. It doesn't restrict how you choose to manage that data internally. But of course, we did also publish a programs ontology. So this was then used as a basis for what schema.org does for its program information. Again, this was pretty early on. I think it was 2007 by now that we published this, possibly slightly later. But yes, and all of the ontologies that the BBC uses still to date are published bbc.co.uk/ontologies. It's probably worth saying that by ontologies in this instance, I mean the classes and things like that rather than the instance data. That is handled by actual user-facing pages. So doing this and concentrating on the data first meant that we could use the same URL for the desktop HTML view, but also mobile views, so content negotiation essentially. This was, again, years before responsive design was a twinkle in the eye of UX people. It's the same URL, but it's a different CSS, effectively. And we could also do machine-readable feeds. So I think it's still true to say that if you were to go to any BBC/programs URL, you could type .xml on the end, .json, .rdf, and you should get the same information as in the HTML, but in a machine-readable way. Again, this is back in 2006, 2007 now, which meant we were in a prime position for something like Twitter. So Twitter bots are now probably all the rage. This is a Twitter bot that somebody set up in the BBC for each of the radio channels to tell you what's now, what's next, that kind of thing. All enabled through the machine-readable feeds that the BBC was producing around its programmes. So I think it's important to remember that what matters is the philosophy, not necessarily the technology. So this was the /programs manifesto that we printed out and put on the wall to remind everyone that it's about the domain model, it's about the subject area, it's about staying true to the user value and using the web for what it's intended to be. Identifying things, connecting them together in a way that makes sense to our users. Yes, so this was very prevalent at the time. So those are kind of the user benefits and the kind of where we got started at the BBC. But what about the business benefits of the linked data? So we could do these, we could have program pages, all well and good. But how do you justify it to the business? So after we'd done the programs domain, attention now turned to music, because the team who made /programs was based in audio music, so music was obviously a good next step. So we thought, okay, well let's have a page for every artist that is played on BBC Radio. So that's exactly what we did. We have a page /music/artist/GUID, and that's for every artist. Now, the GUID is important because what we did here is we didn't mint our own identifiers. We reused the identifiers used by MusicBrainz, which is a structured database, open source, open access about music, artists, releases, things like that. And the reason we used those IDs is because that meant programmatically we could bring in all the data about the releases from MusicBrainz without, no BBC, none of your license fee was spent on creating that information. It was all done by the web. Similarly, because MusicBrainz has a link from its ID to that of the Wikipedia profile, we could automatically import onto a BBC Music page the Wikipedia biography of any music artist. And what we like to call this is essentially using the web as our content management system. So rather than us coming up with our own bespoke CMS and our own private data, the BBC as public service should be contributing to that wider web, so that it benefits not just us, but it benefits everyone. Now, of course, using Wikipedia, people, we got a lot of pushback from editorial going, oh, but, Wikipedia is not reliable and it might get vandalized. Well, you have to then say that Wikipedia is monitored by a very good editorial staff who are very passionate about their subject and will make changes if vandalism happens. But also, again, the BBC can use their expertise to go and fix Wikipedia and help, contribute their knowledge to it. So again, we help both Wikipedia in general and the BBC, which meant we were able to react to big events very, very quickly. So it wasn't the BBC person who first learned of Michael Jackson's death, but somebody on Wikipedia, as soon as it was verified and it got up there, we could update our page straight away and have it accurate and up to date. And of course, true to the spirit, we credit the sources. So we would automatically link to the Wikipedia, to any kind of information we could get from Music Brains, which would take you straight to the artist's own homepage. Again, it's all ultimately with the user in mind. What if they're interested in this artist, they're going to want to have those links, things like that. So you got the user value there. And then we could start connecting up these things. So we've got our programs domain, and we've got our music domain, and of course music gets played on programs. So on our program pages, firstly actually on our artist pages, we could tell you which of our programs, which of our DJs most plays these artists. That was again all done similarly to programs. Both programs and music were fed by existing production systems. So program information is created by the producers of the program, sent to what used to be called Red B, I think they're still called Red B, to create the data for Radio Times and things like that. So all we did was re-import that data in a structured way, and it would automatically produce the program pages. So these weren't manually made ones, they were automatically based on production information. Similarly, we have computer systems in every radio studio which is logging what songs are being played, so we can pipe that exact already existing structured data straight into our user-facing pages and produce things like this. So if you're a fan of a particular artist, you know which BBC programs you're likely to enjoy. Similarly, we could go to a program page and we could provide automatic track listings for those programs with links back to the artist pages. So you start to see not only value to the user from kind of added information for the one URL per thing, but the BBC as a whole benefiting from stitching its sites together. And that's interesting in itself, because once you've done programs and music, what happens next? So once we'd done that, attention naturally got drawn to how the whole of the BBC might stitch up. So this was, I think, 2008 possibly. The idea, we called it the Pentagram. And you can see the different domains of programs, music. We were thinking about users at that point, so we were looking at personalization back then. Topics were the kind of general other, people, places, events, things like that. Events in terms of music events, so we know that we cover Glastonbury, things like that. Food was another one we thought was a nicely structured place, and so we did food next, in fact. And all at the heart, DBpedia helping us link it all up. Of course, it's not quite as easy as that, but the vision was there. Which results, again, in the audiences don't see the BBC's sites as separate. From a business point of view, we talk a lot about 10 products, about news and sport and children's and iPlayer and all this, but to anyone out there, they just care about the thing they're interested in, and it doesn't really matter if it shouldn't have a page which is separate on the BBC, on sport to music to news, things like that. It's all connected. That's how we make sense of the world. So ideally, we should be able to have a whole network of BBC things all connected to each other. So for instance, starting from Doctor Who, because I am obliged to start from Doctor Who in any BBC example. We had Sherlock twice already today, so you could go from Doctor Who to the Daleks, to Terry Nation, who created the Daleks, who was born in Cardiff, as was Dame Shirley Bassey, who then performed at the Electric Proms in 2009. So again, all this kind of entire web of stuff naturally linked. So we talked about what the semantics mean. To me, it's these links are naturally occurring in our minds. They represent how the real world works and how our users might want to navigate through the BBC sites, rather than considering them all separate products. So what happened next after that? Well, the evolution of connected data at the BBC. So this had gone very well. We're getting buy-in. You've got a small team working on it. Interesting things happening. But then the BBC reorganised. And it decided to centralise a lot of its functions. So centralisation, obviously massive change at the BBC. But it also meant that whereas all of that good work I was just showing you was very much concentrated in audio and music, these ideas then spread throughout the rest of the BBC and were mainly taken up by news and sport. So the other big thing that the BBC does, obviously, is its journalism. And here, similar to the situation in programmes when we started, there's a similar situation in journalism in that the amount of coverage had far outstripped the ability for the journalists to be able to report on it, to cover everything that the BBC needed to cover. And also our users' expectations had kind of shifted from back in 2004 where only the big things would get covered to, why isn't the BBC covering all of these things? You can do a page for every programme, why not everything in the world ever that's happening right now? I don't know. So by 2010, we used the Winter Olympics and World Cup 2010, a key part of the audience proposition this time. So right from the beginning of the vision was to have a page for every athlete, every player, every team, every venue, every match, every competition. And this was when we first started using triple stores. So again, we could do a page for Spain. Further down the page there are a link to every single member of Spain's squad. On the match pages you could link between them, all this kind of thing. It was domain driven, and that was the proposition for the site as a whole. Here's an example of a player page, and then we got the stats as well. But you see we're not only linking, we're not only on Arjen Robben's page here, but we're linking to all the other players who have anything related to him. In this case, it's very kind of tangential links. It's other people who have also had shots off target rather than being directly related to him. So interesting ways of kind of discovering things. Then, of course, there was the biggie, 2012, the Olympics, where we partnered with the kind of official Olympics data feeds. And again, we had a page for every single athlete at the Olympics, which was a massive undertaking. Not only that, we had it for every sport, every venue. So this is a huge data operation. And it's worth saying at this point that whereas the BBC's approach to connected data and linked data really started out of a small group of no more than 10, maybe 15 people squirreled away in a corner of a floor in one BBC building in audio and music, by the time of the Olympics, it was big business, right? It's a big deal. So this meant that what had previously been an ad hoc team also in sport became a centralised service, so the linked data platform that the BBC has, which again became something that was open to the rest of the business because the BBC as a whole saw the value in, again, not just sport, not just music, not just programmes, but this is something which can provide value to the whole of the BBC. So to date, we've seen uptake of linked data and this connected data philosophy, programmes, music, sport, news, education. And that has led to what we call BBC Things, so very vague, but it essentially is a URL for every single thing that the BBC is interested in. it's open data. So we don't have loads of information here. It's just kind of the basic data that we need to establish what we're talking about, the type of thing, preferred labels, so external links, things like that. We make it available in Turtle, in JSON-LD, and I think RDF-XML as well. And that in turn is powering our news topic pages. So we first launched it on the news app, that you could do My News and subscribe to topics that you're interested in. Similar to the FT, we now have them on our website as well. So just at the moment, it's just a chronological list of anything tagged with Jeremy Corbyn in this instance. But it's just the beginning, right? This is just a start for having these pages. And again, the user value, because people will search for things. They'll search that people aren't interested in necessarily the articles. What they're interested in is the things those articles are about. That's the thing that we need to target. Those are the things where the real user value is. Excuse me. So this, I took these numbers a couple of days ago, Friday I think it was. To date, we have over 22,000 people tags, 23,000 places. A lot of that is using geonames or a BBC fork of geonames, which we can then contribute back to. Organisations, events, themes. Themes, personally, I think is kind of become our miscellaneous bucket, which I, as a data modeler, I find slightly, but sometimes you do need a kind of a different way of doing things. So I would hope that themes will kind of decrease and we'll get more structure, but we'll see how that goes. So yeah, in total, across not just news but other products as well, we have around 50,000 tags. So there should be a URL for each of these. And ideally, we should be able to publish more structured information about them, more editorial information about them as well. This covers off the BBC News app. So as I said, you have, I want to call it a page, but I guess it isn't really a page in an app, but you have a section for all different types of things, which means we can enable personalization. So you can get the news which is relevant and interesting to you, as well as the stuff which the BBC is known for. And then finally, in terms of our survey of the history of BBC linked data, bringing it right up to date, I'm currently working as product manager on the RES project. So the RES project is about linking up data from cultural institutions across the UK, primarily for use in research and education sector. So the BBC here isn't really building user-facing products. What we're doing is we're going out working with the British Museum, British Library, Wellcome Institute, things like that, helping them publish linked open data. And then we are building a platform and APIs to index that data and organise it by topics, so by the people, the places, the things. That then is coupled with an API which will allow external product developers to build audience-facing products. As the BBC, we don't want to be crowding out the market or stifling competition. We are just providing a service in this platform which will bring together all that data. So it's an open platform to build products for educational use. For educational users, it gives you kind of reliable resources because this stuff ultimately has been curated by the different museums, things like that. And for collections themselves, it gets them in front of a massive educational audience. So we can expose their content to a much wider audience than they could have done before. So that's where we've kind of got up to with linked and connected data at the BBC. But I wanted to cover also some of the challenges. So, BBC is a massive organisation. It goes through reorganisations, government wanting to change the charter, things like that. Things change. So what challenges do these have? Well, first of all, by the end of 2010, the BBC had almost 2,500 top-level directories on its site. Now, of course, top-level directories don't have to equal separate websites, but in the world that the BBC grew up in on the web, it often did. So lots of kind of promotional sites and things like this, not very connected, not very webby. And organisational change is tough, right? If we changed from a philosophy of anyone who wants a website can have one for any program you want, to no, we're going to have 10 BBC products and we're going to centralise and just consolidate on those, but then you get silos. And you miss out on the fact that this is a web, it's a connected thing. So as much as we dreamt of stitching the BBC together back in 2008, organisationally this was a massive challenge. I don't think the organisation was ready for that. There are obviously valid reasons for when you're working in an organisation, you're thinking of the business priorities, and that you simplify and just think of these silos. But the audience value is another thing which you're missing out on. Like I said, the audience doesn't care how you organise your organisation, doesn't care about departments, cares about the things they're interested in. So Slash Programs had about 10, 12 people working on it in a corner. iPlayer, born at exactly the same time, had about a floor of, I don't know how many 100 people working on it. Obviously, iPlayer was much more about access to the actual media, where Slash Programs is more just about the metadata. But Slash Programs has always therefore been the kind of the lesser loved cousin of iPlayer. You've got kind of iPlayer and you've got Slash Programs, and now you've got BBC Store, which is the kind of commercial arm of the BBC. So you've actually ended up with potentially three separate pages on the BBC website for a single program. And there's no reason why these three things, which are completely correct in identifying audience value and audience drivers for these things, there's no reason why they couldn't all be served by a single thing. Sometimes it comes down to kind of organizational change, sometimes politics, sometimes lack of understanding that the web is a connected thing, and you can segment by functionality and things like that, but making these silos isn't always the best idea. If I had been in charge, there's no reason why the front page of iPlayer couldn't be a shop window, but then when you click on any program, you go to the program page, and that is stripped back to enable you to watch. But that's just not the way it is. That's fine. We make the best of what we can. So another thing is sites get mothballed. So Wildlife Finder back in 2010 was one of the other kind of shining exemplars of the BBC using linked data. We published RDF about every single species of animal who've ever been featured in any wildlife clip, because the BBC is famous for natural history programs. This site still exists. I'm not sure whether the open data still exists, but it's all still there. Again, it's a really good example of linking up different parts of the BBC. So on every, so the snow leopards page, you would see all the clips from the BBC archive about snow leopards. So combining power of programs with natural history expertise. But then the BBC reorganises, doesn't want to invest so much in that. What do you do? So these pages all still exist, but how do you design for something which you want to make, ideally you want to make permanent, but what I would emphasise persistence. So even if we aren't going to develop this much longer, at least it's got persistence. It's designed to be as persistent as possible. So we don't want to keep changing the URLs of these things. It's there. We've designed our URLs to be as persistent as possible. I don't think we've solved this problem though. At some point, some of these pages may get switched off, and we need to, as an organisation and generally as an industry, we need to kind of think harder about what we do in these cases. I wanted to touch on inferencing. So we've talked a little bit about inferencing today. I think there's positives and negatives around inferencing. So obviously if you're not going to use any inferencing, quite rightly people have said, well, why bother using triple source? Why bother using RDF? I think there's advantages. So in news, for instance, we have, so BBC Birmingham Black Country is the local news service for that area. And obviously there's various organisations and places. ideally what we want is we don't want journalists to be tagging with BBC Birmingham Black Country, because it's very rare that the article will be about the organisational unit. It will be about the place, it will be about the council. And then what we can do is, what we have used inferencing for, is we've said that these various things are served by or covered by that team. Therefore, if an article is tagged with any of those things, it's probably a good candidate to be served up to the users in that local news service. So using the kind of connections internally to help the editorial proposition and ultimately the audience as well. The downside to inferencing is probably more on the kind of the same as and things like that. When we were working on the Olympics, there was something we used inferencing a bit too wildly, so that a venue became like a sport as well, and it kind of massive explosion, a combinatorial explosion, took down the whole triple store for a couple of days. So you have to be very careful when you're using the inferencing and make sure you're doing it right. So I don't want to say don't use it. It's obviously useful, but be careful when you're using that. Another thing, again, very much to do with different parts of the organisation, is that we obviously have Aberdeen Football Club, but we have Aberdeen the place. Now, in terms of the sport website, they don't want to have to use the label Aberdeen Football Club everywhere, because when you're in the context of sport, if somebody says Aberdeen, they know you're talking about the football club. This again has led to something which personally I think is just a misunderstanding in terms of tags and all that. Some people and journalists are still used to the idea of kind of free text tags and kind of there's nothing more beyond the fact that it's a string, that we're still having to educate people that actually it's an entity which can have multiple strings. There's no reason why we couldn't call this thing Aberdeen Football Club, but also call it Aberdeen, and then you use your presentation logic on the website to choose which one you want. But we haven't got there yet. We still have this argument every so often that no, like news say, right, that's Aberdeen Football Club, that's its actual name, and sport will say, no, its actual name is Aberdeen. It's like, no, you can both be right. There doesn't have to be. Again, it's a common misconception, I think, about linked data as a whole, that we all have to agree on a single model. No, we don't. Anyone can say anything about anything, and that's fine, and that's kind of the beauty of it in a way, but you have to use it in the right way. So the other thing is using it so in our time archive. So you've got thousands of programs from in our time. It's very useful to be able to classify those things by a subject hierarchy and things like that. It's very useful from the context of that single program, which has a very specific way of classifying its subjects. But when you're using a shared platform, not all of these subjects are going to be relevant to everyone. So for instance, we've got a subject here called superpowers. Now when I first saw that superpowers, I think, okay, right, Iron Man, Spider-Man. No, it's to do with America and the British Empire. Yes, these two things now mean totally separate things. You have to, again, be very careful when you're working across such a huge organisation that it's clear what you mean in a specific context. Because what's happened sometimes is that in our time, the editorial folk there will just start creating all these tags which make perfect sense to them, and then journalists get confronted with that and start tagging with stories about Marvel films with superpowers, and it's like, no, they're not the same thing. So again, as always, it comes down to communication between different parts of your enterprise, different parts of your organisation. And I think, again, there are ways in which you can have the benefits. You can have both linked data across the organisation and effectively siloed things which make sense in certain contexts. What you don't want is to have to choose between either completely siloed or completely linked and everyone must see everything. Slightly strange one next. Sheep. This has come into effect on Res, in that when we're trying to encourage external collection holders to publish linked open data, a huge source of confusion has been over the licensing. So what we mandate is that the data which describes your assets should be licensed openly, explicitly licensed. So within the data you publish about your assets, you should have a link to a license, Creative Commons, Open Government License, whatever. What people end up stating a lot in their RDF is that the actual concept, the actual asset, is openly licensed. So we have people claiming, or not openly licensed, it's possession of the Tate. So at one point, I think it was the Tate were claiming, don't quote me on the Tate, could be somebody else, and were quoting that they own the copyright over sheep, the concept of sheep. No. You have the rights over a document you're publishing which describes sheep, and that's fine. You can have your own that. But, again, this kind of difference between the data you're publishing and the concepts you're talking about, it's getting that distinction right. It can be a very big challenge. I think a lot of time has been spent, myself and other data architects on the project of RES, helping communicate that and helping getting people used to this idea. And I think the final kind of challenge really is around proving the business value of linked open data and graphs versus unstructured data. I mean, unstructured data is speedy. You can query it very quickly with Elasticsearch and all this kind of thing. Like, why should we bother at all with structured data? Why should we bother at all with opening our data at all? Well, for the BBC, that we've got a public service remit that we should be kind of releasing the information. There's obviously the argument that a lot of this information is already published in the HTML, so why not? You're just kind of opening up to a different audience. You often get that business will see a massive commercial value in the program listing information. But again, we publish it openly as HTML or to other places, so there's still a bit of a way to go to realise, like one of the previous speakers was talking about, that this is equivalent to us publishing the menu. It's not publishing the food, right? And there's, it's fine in that. I think the other thing is also getting too technical. So obviously, where you need to, get into kind of rigorous OWL semantics about things, if it's of value to you and your audience, then do it. But sometimes there is often a big temptation in the linked data world and connected data worlds to kind of double down and get obsessed with getting the models exactly correct and very, very complex and exactly right. And I think that, that obscures the value for users. So you really need to think about what's important to your users and try and combine that, really be as accurate as you need to be, but don't be, too obsessed with that. Similarly, going down the route of having Sparkle endpoints, which might be very appropriate for certain types of users. I'm not saying don't do that, but again, I always come back to the fact that /programs was done off a relational database. It produced linked open data, and it was all around a page for every program, and it was all linked together. So you could do queries, and you didn't even have kind of query string URLs. You had a persistent URL for various things which normally you would solve by queries. So I guess the way to sum up on these challenges really is that semantics doesn't exist in a vacuum. You need people who understand it, who see the value in it beyond immediate needs, because obviously if you ask your users what they want, they'll probably just want flat tagging, but we can see that there's benefits in doing more than that. But without thinking about how real, actual people will use it, it's going to be useless as well. So to finish off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of connected data. So, personally, I think the future is bright. Sometimes when people ask what I do, I say I design webs. I'm a web designer, I design webs. If I was being more poetic, I would say that I tell stories to machines. And what I mean by this is that I think narrative and storytelling is going to be increasingly important, especially in the world of journalism and the BBC. And I don't just mean that in terms of visualization and interactives, I mean actually to the point of structured data. So in terms of TV shows, there's a book, Everything Bad is Good for You, by Stephen Johnson, and he notes that how over time, TV dramas have got more complex. So you start off with, any episode of Dragnet was a single plot, and that was it. And over time, you get multiple plots, and then you get, hundreds of plots, like in The Wire and things like this. Things are getting more complex, more involving, more networked. They're being designed to be binged or repeat watched, and they actually reflect the complexity of the real world. You go from drama, which is very staged, to drama, which is, at least as confusing as what's going on in British politics. And that's because the impact of the internet and the web has enabled us to be more tuned into the fact that, as Ted Nelson, the person who coined the term hypertext, said, everything is deeply intertwingled. And now we're beginning to tell stories and take advantage of that. So what's the difference between Midsummer Murders and Columbo? Anyone? Well, so they're both presented as linear stories, but they're not linear. Underneath it all, they're always actually webs. So Midsummer Murders, you start with the murder, then you see the investigation, the accusation. It's only towards the end that you see the motive. Whereas something like Columbo, you see it from the murderer's point of view straight away. It's the same story, but told in different ways. And underneath this kind of very linear presentation is actually a whole network of intrigue, of plot, of things like that. Storytelling is the dramatization of the process of knowledge assimilation. Storytelling is weaving a path over a web of data. And we've known this for ages. So Aristotle described plot as a web of events that make each other likely or necessary. And again, we're now getting to the stage where we have a medium which can fully represent those things. So iPlayer is a great start because it gives us a page for the video. But the internet is a delivery platform. The web is a medium in itself. And we need to start thinking about how we represent the world and storytelling online in the way that treats the web as a medium itself. So a web of events. Another Doctor Who example. Characters connected to each other. Now, not all of this web is revealed straight away in a story. Part of the kind of the beauty and the poetic nature of storytelling is the revelation of these links. So the order in which you reveal links is a key part of storytelling. But underneath it all, there is this web of connections. Finally, Nicholas Negroponte, who founded MIT's Media Lab, Wired Magazine, and One Laptop Per Child. He wrote in 1996 that he knew we'd be in for a glut of kind of information. He was talking about programs. Don't deal with it at all. Let an agent deal with that. What we need is bits which describe the narrative. So I'm not talking about classification systems and metadata. I'm talking about going inside that program, describing the web of data within it. The bits about the bits change broadcasting totally. The networks will finally know what networking is about. This is the thing which I think is crucial to broadcasting, but also to other industries. That hierarchical ways that we've classified information, they're still valid, but I don't think we should be relying on them. We now have a web medium which can, we can exploit and we can make better and we can use it to be more powerful. We talked about kind of every episode having its own page. I want every episode to be its own API, which means I want the internet of fictional things as well as the internet of real things. Because everything is deeply intertwined, you start with drama, but that can easily extend to documentaries and then ultimately to news. And yes, that's what I see as the future of connected data. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Really, really interesting presentation. Got time for a few questions.
Hello. Hello. Who wants to go first?
Hi, thanks for that. I think it's a really good example of what you can do with really nicely linked open data. It's a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit? So I think what underpins all this, right, is the quality of the data that you collect from the data producers, effectively. Can you talk a little bit? I imagine that's a big challenge, right? It sounds expensive.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about how you manage that?
So in terms of res, part of the function is that we go out and kind of almost consult with the data providers and help them shape and educate them into that, but obviously that's not very scalable. So it's a tough one. I think it's all about kind of starting small, working with editorial people, and also I think not getting them too worried about the technology, reminding them that we're trying to describe the same things that they're describing. So I think what we need is better tools and things which help them get familiar with it, so that they should just be able to produce the data in the way that they normally do, because it's useful to them, and then we create the linked data behind the scenes. Yeah, but it is a challenge.
Yeah. So do you end up with tools that the providers, the data producers use to help them generate that structured data?
Exactly.
So do you have a challenge there with like updating and maintaining those when the sorts of metadata that you're going to want to collect, or the sort of structure that you want to collect, changes, and does that have consequences both on the tools for the data producers and then for the website?
It does. I mean, we tend to try and not get into, not apply this to stuff which is changing so much. One thing that has affected is kind of, I suppose, more our URL strategy. So in terms of news, that breaking news, you may call it something at first, and then it turns out it wasn't a bombing, it was something else. So you need to think about how these things are going to change over time. But yeah, it's definitely an issue.
Are you still doing the Wikipedia thing where you're using that as your CMS?
So yes, it's still part of the music artist profiles. I think it's possibly less obvious now on the website, but it's still being used.
And have you expanded that to other areas, or that was specifically music artists?
Music was the main thing where we did it.
Okay.
I think because we felt as a BBC we weren't the authority on it, whereas when we do things like programs, we're producing those ourselves, so we can be the authority on it.
Okay.
Is that a question back there?
Okay, I think you've missed something.
Go on, please.
You've got an internationalisation problem.
Sorry.
You know how to internationalise a website to make it work in English and Welsh.
Yes.
That's the problem you have with sports and news.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, RDF only thinks human languages were worth specifying.
Right.
So you can say English, but you need to be able to say English sports.
Yes. Yes.
And that's something we haven't solved yet, but we
Yes.
need to, because we've encountered the same thing, that 3 universities have exactly the same thing, but they call it different things, and there'll be a fight on your hands if the label's not right, but it doesn't matter what the ID is.
Yes, so exactly, so I think there are solutions and ways around it. Like we said, you can have multiple labels, and you need to assign some kind of context to them, things like that. But
Dialect.
Yes, exactly. But helping the business and editorial understand that's possible is still a challenge.
To follow up maybe on this, because I was really curious about one knowledge presentation problem, namely contextualization. So, because you gave many hints in different places about this, and obviously in such a big data set and big knowledge presentation system, it must be an issue. So do you have any fixed set of policies or some principled way of handling this?
Probably the best concrete example at the moment is what we're doing right now around the World Service. So the World Service is starting to have topic pages as well, and there were two proposals for this. So we could either create new URIs for the same things, or we could have the single URI and have separate labels and say which languages they were in. I think, so my personal view is that for the things which are more concrete, like people, then we should go for the single URI, different labels. But for things which are much more ephemeral, like themes, things which are going to be different in different cultures, then I would probably go for separate URIs and then use ways to link them up if appropriate, because I wouldn't want to say that something in one culture is exactly the same as something in another culture. So both approaches have their merits. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee, his view is very much everyone coins their own terms and their own things, and then you link them up later, rather than trying to get to that single thing. At the same time, you balance that with you should only really have a single URL for a thing. So it's being pragmatic, but World Service is probably the place where we've got as practically as far as we can right now. The sport and news thing is still kind of stuck more on the editorial level. Anything else?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Paul. And round of applause, I think. Very